everyone, and welcome once again to the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, where every show I talk to writers from across the literary spectrum about their work and how they do what they do, from huge New York Times bestsellers to folks just getting their work out there for the first time. The Open Mic is, and has always been, about and for writers and the experience of writing and publishing in the modern age. For those who don't know, this show is available by the same name on both my YouTube channel and via all of the major podcast platforms. And you can subscribe to either or both so you never miss a thing. And if you do, please leave me a nice review, leave me 5 stars, help other people find the show. That'd be great because you don't want to miss the kind of content, especially that I've got for you today. My guest today is a longtime television writer with credits including Miami Vice and JAG, Star Trek: The Next Generation, and most notably, his Emmy Award-winning work on Law and Order. He is a former journalist whose work has appeared in Rolling Stone, Spy, The New Yorker, Harper's, and Esquire, among others. And he's also a 2-time Edgar Award winner. Today, he's here with me, though, to talk about his fabulous debut novel, Wealth Management, which I can honestly say I could barely put down once I got it started. Really a great book. His writing has been compared to Elmore Leonard, Jess Walter, John le Carre, and that's just to name a few. And after reading it, I have to say I concur. It is seriously one of the best crime or financial thrillers I've read in a long, long time. Please welcome Ed Zuckerman to the Open Mic. Hello, Ed. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, it's great to be here, Rich. Thank you for having me.
Oh, believe me, the pleasure is all mine. So let me get started. Just for the uninitiated, give us the nickel tour on wealth management, and we'll get into it a little more as we go along. But give us your nickel tour on the book and what it's about.
Well, it actually started in the aftermath of 9/11. It was reported that someone shortly before that horrible day had shorted airline stocks. I assume you know what that means. That when you short a stock, you make money if a stock price goes down. So someone had shorted several airline stocks and made a fortune as a result of airline stocks going in the toilet after 9/11. And it was investigated. I was concerned that had Osama bin Laden done this, made a few $1 million off the tragedy. The FBI investigated, the SEC investigated, and it turned out there was a total coincidence. On any given day, someone somewhere is shorting every stock in the world. And it was some mutual fund in Kansas. I don't know what it was. It was a total coincidence. So that gave me the germ of a story idea about having some young wealth managers who have some dodgy clients who make investments that profit if stocks go down, and the companies they invest in that way start blowing up, figuratively and literally. And if you're a young wealth manager and you need this investment money and you're not quite sure what's going on, what do you do? So I have 3 attractive young people who are classmates from Harvard Business School, alumni of Harvard Business School. They're in a love triangle. They're in Geneva because thrillers like to have a somewhat exotic setting. And 2 of the 3 are handling investments either wittingly or unwittingly for dirty clients. And one of them is secretly investigating them for the U.S. Treasury Department.
Well, I will tell you, like I say, it comes out of the gate fast and it stays that way the whole time. And I really want to emphasize something here because this is, of course, fiction, but you note that it comes out of visiting many of the places that are in the book. You mentioned Geneva, there's Nigeria, Switzerland. Tell me a little bit more about how you established the wheres, the locale for this book.
Well, I've been a writer my entire life, and for the first 10 or 20 years, I was a journalist. And I believe that real stuff is more interesting than stuff you make up. And if you're going to write about something, you want to include reality. Also, by thrillers do tend to take readers to exotic locales. That's sort of even from James Bond going off to wherever, Monte Carlo or whatever. And so I spent a lot of time in Geneva, which is the setting of my book. That began when I had some friends there and I was visiting them and found it to be a very interesting place. And then when I wanted to introduce a character who was a police officer from Nigeria, who came to Geneva to investigate a crime that had occurred in Nigeria. Well, how can I write about a Nigerian police officer? I can just make shit up. I can Google stuff, or I can steal stuff from other novels set in Nigeria, or I could go to Nigeria. It wasn't that easy to find a way to get to meet Nigerian police officers. Nigeria is a tourist unfriendly country, shall we say. It's a tough town. They don't need you, and they expect the same. Excuse me. I woke up with a cold today, but it's not cold. But I took a test. I'm clear. So it's a long story. I can tell you if you want to hear it, but I ended up going to Nigeria with an introduction arranged by an Oxford University sociologist whom I met online, who had done research in Nigeria. And I met some Nigerian cops and ex-cops and hung out with them. And their stories transmuted became the basis of my Nigerian character. And that was, and my first night in Nigeria, I went to a Passover Seder, which was ridiculous how that happened, but that's another story.
Well, yeah, because your Nigerian police officer is Jewish.
Yes, it turns out that's not why I went to a Seder, but one of the major ethnic groups in Nigeria are the Igbos, and some Igbos believe they are descended from one of the lost tribes of Israel. They have certain customs in their culture that are similar to the Jewish customs. Although the Israeli Supreme Court ruled they are not Jews, but some of them beg to differ.
Well, really quick, real quick follow up on the concept of reality in fiction. One of our good friends from this show, Jonathan Mayberry, who writes horror and dark fantasy thrillers, is quite successful. He is fond of saying, he really tries to put as much real science into his fiction as possible, because from his perspective, if there are, let's say, 10 aspects to something, and 9 of them are based very plausibly in reality, you can do anything in the world you want with the 10th one, right? You can make it as fantastical as you want, because the other 9 really resonate and seem very real to readers. And I had only thought of it in that term of thrillers and kind of fantasy things. But hearing you say that now, it's like, well, of course, that makes perfect sense. If you're basing this fictional story with all those reality about shorts and how the financial system actually works, it really does lend an air, I should say, of credibility to it. I thought it was.
I think readers, especially of books like thrillers, like to learn a little something along the way, as long as it's not shoveled at them like a school textbook.
Mm-hmm.
To go to a new world, new characters, new techniques, new anything. I think it's part of the appeal of that kind of fiction.
Absolutely. Well, we've seen the world become so tilted in favor of the 1%. And I think many of the people out there feel that the financial game is so rigged in favor of that 1%, or at least a very small number of, morally bankrupt, or at the very least, morally dubious people. And in that regard, I feel like you did one of the hardest things a writer can do, which is to have a collection of said morally dubious characters, but who are still likable and for whom the reader can really root for. So tell me, if you would, a little bit about how you developed Rafe and Catherine and Majid, because to me, they're very memorable characters.
That's my love triangle of 3 young financial professionals who met as friends at Harvard Business School. In New York and in Geneva, I met with people who work in finance, and they're not necessarily bad people. In fact, my daughter right now is going to Harvard Business School. If the professors read this book, they may throw her out. I don't know, because the alumni from that school in the real world get into some trouble. So I just, I'm a writer, and I was a smart kid, and I became a writer, and my friends became writers or doctors or lawyers, and some of them just ended up in finance. And there's nothing inherently evil about them, although God knows there are plenty of evil people in them. But I wasn't writing about the Bernie Madoffs, writing about the young, ambitious people who either, for lack of another, sometimes just by chance, followed the easy path in life that led them to good-paying jobs on Wall Street. And then, 5 years down the road, suddenly turns out they have a client who may be blowing up the world on the side. And it's, holy shit, what have I got myself into? I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It does. Um, and as we've been talking about, of course, the subject here is serious. I mean, terrorism and money laundering, murder, those are all very serious things. But you still sprinkle a fair amount of humor throughout this story. And in my previous life, I was in the blue collar world, and I've known lots of people who. My brother is a cop. I've known many folks in law enforcement, first responders, people in very, very serious, high pressure jobs. Um, and the one thing they seem to all have in common is that is a very dark, sometimes very dark sense of humor, very wise ass sense of humor. And I really felt that coming through with all your characters, right? I really liked how you injected humor into all this because it didn't feel forced or unrealistic. It really felt how these characters might talk to each other. So, tell me a little bit about your use of humor in your writing, and how much of that is just your natural style versus something maybe you thought about a little bit.
It is my natural style, and it's been a great benefit to me over the years, both in journalism and in TV writing, and now in novel writing. I guess it's the way I see the world. Um, I wrote a nonfiction book years ago about all the crazy plans the U.S. government had for fighting and surviving and winning a nuclear war, and the plans were crazy. They'd been compiled in the 1950s, and they were just on a shelf somewhere. And there was a plan. There was a post-nuclear attack food rationing system. There was a post-nuclear attack income tax system, and it was horrible and terrifying, and it was hilarious. When I worked in TV on the TV show Law and Order, which I'm sure a lot of you people everyone knows Law and Order. It's on the original one. I was known in-house as writing the funny episodes. Now, most people didn't realize there were funny episodes of Law and Order. But there was always some wisecracking in every episode because the cops were prone to that. But I'm actually one of the first scripts I wrote for Law and Order back, oh God, in the 90s. Dick Wolf, who created the show and was very hands-on at that point. Now he's up in the cloud somewhere. I mean, not literally, but figuratively. He came by my office one day and he said, Ed, I've got your new script. Good job. Thank you very much. We're going to shoot it, 2 weeks from now. But I'm giving it back to you right now because I've circled every joke. There's a joke on every page, and take out half of them. Your choice, because it's not a comedy, and we'll go ahead and shoot it. But I think bringing a little humor to any kind of writing, even on serious subjects, is very welcome. There's one or two. I'm not going to name names, but one or two hugely best-selling crime novelists whose prose is utterly devoid of wit, and I just don't get it.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I mean, I think most people can relate to that. Whatever your world is, whatever it is you do to make a living or whatever, I think that's how most people get through the day, right? And the higher the pressure of your job, the more serious the stakes of your job, probably the darker that humor becomes, because it's probably the only place you can make certain jokes. I had a sister-in-law who was a neonatal ICU nurse for a long time.
Wow.
And, when you're dealing with, very, very sick preemies, and many, many times they don't make it, they had some of the blackest humor, and I remember the one time she made this reference to this child they had who was doing okay, but she referred to this I think it was a girl a couple times as an FLK, and I said, okay, I'm not a medical person. What's an FLK? And she goes, oh, sorry, funny looking kid. and it's just like, this is what they say to each other, right? And that's just their way of saying she's fine. This she'll grow out of the things that we're seeing right now. She's just a funny looking kid. It'll get better. And it made me very cognizant from that point forward of just how dark sometimes the humor can be when you're, in a situation that, often is actual life and death for those folks. But even if you're dealing with large amounts of money or any kinds of pressures, I mean, I've definitely seen it. Again, I've been around politics a long time. You see some
brother. Yeah.
Some incredibly what would be inappropriate commentary outside of the walls, but inside, everyone just nods and goes on, right? Um, so we've noted you've worked in TV, you've written nonfiction, you're a journalist for a long time. What inspired you to try your hand at a novel?
Well, excuse me, I woke up with a cold this morning. I'll make a slight adjustment here. Well, for a writer of my generation, a novel was always the ultimate goal. And historically, a lot of writers, a lot of novelists began their careers as journalists, which is great training for writing a novel, seeing the real world. And then I kind of got sidetracked after being a journalist for a while into writing for television, which of course is fiction. And I finally, as my TV career was winding down a few years ago, I had this leftover idea from TV that I thought would lend itself to a novel. And so I had the time, I had the opportunity. And to be blunt, because I'd worked in TV, I could afford to write a novel. Writing a first novel, this is my third book, but my first novel. Writing a first novel is not any kind of way to make a living nowadays.
Right.
So I was like, I had like the Ed Zuckerman fellowship to Ed Zuckerman to give me the year to write a novel. And now that it's out, boy, it's a tough business. I'll tell you, it's a tough business. There are too many books published. That's my complaint.
Well, we're gonna talk about publishing in a minute. But there's somehow because again, we mentioned TV. What got you into writing for TV, and what maybe did you take from that experience that helped you in writing this novel?
I got into TV through a fluke. Nowadays, the whole TV world is very corporatized. No one can be hired for a show unless they're vetted by the network executives and the studio executives. And now, of course, the diversity thing is very important. So you're vetted for your ethnicity. And I got into a friend, a total fluke. I had a friend who had a friend who was a novelist who became a writer for Hill Street Blues, who got him into the business. And then he was on Miami Vice, and they were looking for new writers. Actually, Michael Mann was running Miami Vice at the time, who became quite a prominent movie director. And Michael Mann had the crazy idea that would not be tolerated now by the studio or the executive, the studio or network people. He said, well, let's freshen up the show by getting some non-TV writers to write scripts for Miami Vice. So this friend of mine named David Black, who's a very fine writer, was delegated to come to New York. And he recruited a bunch of journalists, novelists, poets, playwrights, essayists to come in and pitch TV ideas to Michael Mann for an episode of Miami Vice. And I had just finished writing a book about a Texas rancher, a true book. I'd followed this guy around for a while, and he was a great and colorful character. And he was importing cattle from the Virgin Islands to America, and they flew on a plane from St. Croix to Miami. And I flew on that plane with the cows from St. Croix to Miami. And so I was aware, most people don't know this, but there's a very large, at least there used to be, and probably still is, a major cattle importation facility at the Miami International Airport. So I was asked to pitch an idea for a Miami Vice. I thought, well, I know about this cattle facility. So I had an idea where Crockett and Tubbs, who were the main characters, these very glamorous anti-narcotics cops in Miami, were on a stakeout watching for a drug dealer coming into Miami Airport. And while they're there, they get caught in a cattle stampede, which was a very unconventional idea for Miami Vice. It goes back to my predilection for humorous settings, and they bought it. And then one thing led to another.
Wow. Yeah, I have to admit, I loved Miami Vice. I was living in LA, I think, at the time when it came out, and MTV was becoming really, really big, and that whole kind of MTV style cops. I mean, and that was just fun stuff. I can remember, as a much younger person then too, of course. And so
we were children at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Early 80s. I was definitely not
late 80s, please.
Was the process in writing this novel different for you from your other work? Was there anything about this that was a unique experience for you compared to how you'd worked before?
Yeah, it was really hard. It was it was I thought, having written narrative nonfiction in magazine and journalism and in 2 nonfiction books, and having written or supervised the writing of, I don't know, hundreds of TV scripts that were fiction, that, well, how hard can it be to make the transition to writing a novel? Boy, was I wrong. I mean, if you're writing a TV script, you can have, if Ed and Rich are having a conversation in a restaurant, you go interior restaurant night, Ed and Rich are sitting at a table, and then it's dialogue, 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 dialogue. Well, in a novel, you have to describe the damn restaurant and what's going on and the atmosphere.
But not too much, right?
But not too much. Actually, that's another pet peeve of mine. I get bored reading and writing description. I have read other best-selling books where every time the character looks out the window, you're told what the clouds look like. I'm not interested in that. In fact, one thing you may notice, having read my book, is that in some ways it reads like a slightly augmented TV script. The chapters are very short and they're dialogue heavy. But even so, there was a lot of stuff you have to fill in prose that you don't have to fill in a TV script. Also, the plot was much more complicated. I have, as you know, there's an A story and a B story and a couple of minor C stories. These are TV terms, but I probably translate to prose fiction. And you're doing a TV script that's about 55 pages. And I was able to see from the beginning to the end of a 55-page script without breaking my head. But to go from the beginning to the end of a 300-page novel with pretty complicated plots, and also as a thriller, they all had to come together at the end.
Yeah,
there had to be a climax, and it took me. I had an A story and a B story, 2 different wealth managers dealing with 2 different shady characters, and they were really separate stories. But I had to get all the people together on the same street in Geneva on the same day at the end of the book. I knew that. And that took me a long time to figure out how to do that. So
plotting. Well, I ask everybody this. What's more difficult for you, character development or plotting?
Well, coming out of TV, the plot is key. I mean, well, also you know who the characters are if you're writing episode 200 of a TV series. But I mean, they're equally important. But the character development, once I had the basic idea of what these characters were that would kind of accrue naturally as I wrote. Just when they began talking to each other, and I'm not saying the characters took on lives of their own, but you began writing dialogue that made sense, and that there'd be attitudes, and it would kind of grow naturally. Whereas the plot, you really had to think about that. And some people apparently can plot out long novels from beginning to end. And others, I think in the novel writing thing, there's these terms I've discovered since I started writing. There's plotters and pantsers. You probably heard these terms. I tried to plot ahead. I could not plot the whole thing out. I could plot the next 20 or 30 or 40, 50 pages out. But then I'd leave my characters in a certain place and go, well, what do I do now? What makes sense to do now that's heading me toward the same general direction I need to be in? I think Lee Child is famous for not working things out ahead of time. And sometimes you can tell that when you get to the end of the book, even though I think I admire him a great deal, because I think he writes with great style and great wit, which I appreciate.
Yeah, I'm fascinated because, like I say, I ask a lot of people that question, and I really thought that there would be more people that were outliners, and very, very few that would be pantsers. But I think what you're describing is what most people are, is a mix of the two. I know for me, just in my own work, trying to go seat of the pants, all I did was write myself into circles and into dead ends all the time. I ended up sitting down, and I didn't do, like, I know people who will literally have a 100-page outline of story. And okay, if that works for you, I couldn't do that. So I had something that was about 10 pages or maybe 20, but it, chapter by chapter.
Yeah.
but it still left a lot of room for creativity. And I don't know. Everyone's got to find out what works for you, for themselves. And it seems to me like you have found that mix that works for you.
Well, there had to be a climax, and the bad guys had to go down. That I knew. And my original idea that I had for a long time was preposterous. It involved two of my characters on a cruise ship chasing around a terrorist with a bomb, which made no sense at all. Excuse me, not COVID. I took the test. But I could go 30 or 40 pages out, and then I'd have to stop and think for a while. For I had the luxury of time. I mean, it took me a long time to write this book. Years ago, he died last year. Stuart Woods, you may know the novelist Stuart Woods. Mm-hmm. He was writing 2 best-selling novels a year. And there's a certain level of crime novelists who, once they're famous, they stay famous. Once you're a bestseller, it's sort of automatic. And I knew him socially. We were drinking one night, and he said to me, Ed, my agent called me, and he said, if you're doing 2 novels a year, Stuart, could you do 3? And Stuart said, yeah. I said, well, sure, why not? Now I can't imagine. I can't imagine that.
That's a lot. Well, you mentioned Paul Levine. He was on the open mic back in our early incarnation before we were on video. And I noticed in his blurb for you, he referred to wealth management as being, quote, camera ready for a feature film, unquote. Now, I definitely agree with that, because the format, as you noted, short chapters, very fast pacing, it lends itself to that. Have you, and maybe you can't talk about this, but, any thoughts
on talk about it? Rights are available.
Well, that's the question. Has anyone approached you about optioning for TV or film yet?
There's an agent in LA who's currently peddling those rights, but if anyone's made a good offer, word has not reached me yet. So anyone listening, rights are available.
Well, okay. Well, and along those lines, and again, you may not. I don't want to be giving away spoilers here, but has anyone thought about a sequel to this? Was it written as an intention to be a series, or is it standalone, and then we'll see what happens? Where are you at with the future plotting?
Well, I would like to do a sequel, and I'd like to keep some of the same characters in the sequel. My main character, Rafe, is a wealth manager himself, and he's also a semi-spy for the U.S. Treasury Department. And my Nigerian cop character, all the readers people like that character. I actually had until last year, I had a daughter, one who's not at Harvard Business School, was living in St. Petersburg, Russia. And I thought that would be a great setting for a sequel to this book. And I actually had rented an apartment in St. Petersburg to live in last spring for a month or 2 to do additional research. Then, of course, in February, Putin launched the war in Ukraine. And my daughter, who'd been living in there since St. Petersburg for 6 years, very hurriedly grabbed her Russian husband and dragged this poor guy to Brooklyn. So actually, the least serious outcome of the war in Ukraine was I lost the setting for my next novel. So I've actually I have since last spring visited Helsinki twice. So I now have a setting for my novel. The plot is still a work in progress.
All right. Well, as I noted in the intro, you've had a long and somewhat eclectic career. I didn't note in the intro the 2 nonfiction books, but I did note that you had written a lot for many of the major magazines, and I noted in your bio, this caught my attention right away. Some of the issues that you've covered have included zombies, killer bees, and talking apes, and I was really hoping you could share a little insight into some of those issues that you have covered.
Okay, well, let's see. Take them in reverse order. Talking apes. This goes way back a long time now. Starting in the late 70s, there were several people working with chimpanzees and gorillas, teaching them human sign language. exploring the nature of language and nature of animal intelligence. Two of the most famous animals were Washoe, the sign language speaking chimpanzee, and Coco the gorilla, who was being raised in a trailer on the campus of Stanford University at the time. Well, Rolling Stone sent me to interview these animals and their human keepers, and I interviewed Washoe, who asked me for a cigarette as we parted. And I interviewed Coco the gorilla, who said to me in sign language, "I love you, come tickle me." So that was fascinating, and both the animals were fascinating, and the people who were training or tending these animals were also fascinating. That whole field of scientific inquiry seems to have died out in the years since I wrote about them.
Yeah.
As for killer bees, this also goes back a long time. I keep dating myself, but starting in the 1970s, there were reports of these very dangerous bees in South America, and they were coming this way, coming to America. The killer bees are coming. The killer bees are coming. There were some silly horror movies made about the killer bees are coming, and again,
SNL skits.
Yeah,
SNL skits.
That was hilarious. And the killer bees, FYI, are really ordinary honeybees. Their sting is no more deadly than a normal honeybee, but they are more inclined to attack you in large numbers and follow you at greater distances if you disturb their hive. So Rolling Stone sent me to South America, where I hung out with some entomologists who were studying the killer bees in French Guiana, this sort of bizarre little corner of South America. It's actually a French colony or French territory. And I spent a couple of weeks with the killer bees and the killer bee scientists. I was stung by killer bees and lived to tell the tale in Rolling Stone in about 5,000 words. And this gave me an entrepreneurial idea. A friend of mine and I thereafter went into the killer bee honey business. We imported and marketed genuine killer bee honey from South America as a gourmet / gift / novelty item, which was available at finer department stores and gourmet stores all over America for a very short period, a long time ago. Wow. Now, as for the zombies, there was a Harvard connection to that. There was a Harvard ethnobotanist named Wade Davis, who's had quite a distinguished career since then, who discovered in a book that he wrote that zombies had a basis in fact. There was a certain poison found in some fish. In fact, this fish is a sushi delicacy in Japan called the fugu fish.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And chefs who prepare this have to be very specially trained and licensed to prepare fugu for sushi, because if you eat the wrong part of that fish, it puts you into a catatonic state that can either kill you or make you appear to be dead, even if you're not really dead. And there were stories from Japan of people banging on their coffins on the way to be buried when they come out of this catatonic state. So this guy, Wade Davis, went to Haiti and discovered that certain voodoo sorcerers, known as bokors, were administering this poison to people for various reasons. And they'd be declared dead, they'd be buried, and then the bokors would dig them up from their grave the night after the funeral. And if they weren't actually dead by that point, which some of them were, they would lead them away into slavery. There was actually a very famous zombie in Haiti, a guy named Clairvis Narcisse, who got sick one day, was pronounced dead by doctors at an American hospital in Haiti, and 20 years later, his sister was in a marketplace and saw him because he'd been dug up by this voodoo sorcerer and led into slavery, worked on a plantation, and now he was in this marketplace buying a mango or something.
Oh my goodness.
So I went down there and I took a zombie to lunch, and he was famous in Haiti. The waiters were very impressed. Oh, it's Clairvis Narcisse, the zombie. And so there was a scientific basis for zombification, and I wrote about that for Outside magazine. This may be more than you want to know about any of these stories.
No, this is fabulous. And, it's funny. Over the years, I've had a lot of people talk to me and ask about getting into freelance writing. I did a lot of freelancing. Even on all the years that I've been employed at a publication, I've also done a fair amount of freelancing. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people will come that want to get into it. They know me a little bit, so they'll say, "Hey, can you give me some information?" And one of the first things I always tell them is, you really have to think like an entrepreneur. If you're going to do this, you really have to think entrepreneurially. And so when you mentioned the honeybee importing uh,
Honey.
project that I'm thinking see, there it goes. There's the proof. You always have to be thinking if you're going to freelance. You got to be a thinker. You got to be entrepreneurial, man. Look for those opportunities where they come.
Freelance journalism is, I mean, the internet has basically been terrible for freelance journalism.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
before there were online publications, the big magazines like Rolling Stone and Vogue and Vanity Fair and Harper's and Esquire, you could actually, make a living. But now, for a young person, it's
Yeah. My advice to most people these days has turned from, whatever it used to be to, yeah, you don't want to do this. Only do it when you don't need it. Because if you need it, you're not going to make it. But
yeah, no, it's just brutal. I mean, I can't imagine doing that.
well, along those lines, the TV landscape has changed almost as much as the publishing industry over the last 20 years. I mean, Netflix, the um, proliferation of so many other streaming services, etc. Just the massive number of streaming services out there alone has been really amazing to watch. Um, do you think the atmosphere is better or worse for writers now, and especially for new writers, than it was when you broke in? Because it seems like there's more opportunity, but there's also maybe less opportunity. What's your perspective on that?
Well, there are a million shows, and so you would think that there'd be more jobs for more writers, but in fact, the potential supply seems to have risen to meet the demand. So it's very competitive to get into the business. Even though I worked on TV for a long time, and I worked uh, even after Netflix and all the others came into existence, I only worked on traditional broadcast network shows. My last show was Law and Order Special Victims Unit, which is now, I think, in its 24th season or something crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But there's talk of a writer's strike this year. The contract is up, and the way things work now, it's more corporatized, and writers are being squeezed into working on shows with shorter seasons, and you get paid per episode. And if there's fewer episodes, there's less pay. The traditional broadcast network show was 22 episodes a year, and now Netflix is something 8 episodes, 10 episodes. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction in the writing community. I'm slightly out of it now, but I know people are struggling, and there's talk of a strike this year.
Yeah, like everything else, right? It's really getting winnowed down. I only have a couple more, but one thing I really wanted to ask you, um, and I don't ask questions like this, Rick. I hate it in sports when somebody says, "Hey, how did it feel to do whatever?" Well, how do you think it feels to win the Super Bowl? To me, that's a dumb question. But you won an Emmy and you've won a couple of Edgar Awards, and those are really huge accomplishments in this field because, as you know, it's tough. It's really, really hard. So I'm going to break my own rule here and just ask you, what was it like to win an Emmy? I just think that is such a tremendous accomplishment.
Well, I was part of a group. I won my Emmy when Law and Order won an Emmy for Best Dramatic Series. And so about 8 or 10 of us all trooped up on the stage together. And I didn't say a word. Dick Wolf accepted the award on behalf of the group, but we were waving it around, and we had a picture on the front page of Variety the next day, and it was great. Although we won it back, God, in the late '90s, and there were fewer parties. It was less of a hoopla then than it is now. That really grew in years after that. So after the ceremony was over, and we all had our Emmys, and there was the official party, but all the cool after parties didn't exist yet. So we all went to some bar in Burbank and sat around with our Emmys talking to the waitress. I mean, it was not that. It was a little anticlimactic.
I love that.
Yeah, but Edgar's. Actually, I just finished being on the panel of judges for the best TV script in the Edgars this year, and I'm sure the nominees will be very excited, and the winner will be very excited. And it was kind of, it's nice to get some recognition. I was also thrilled to publish a novel after all these years, because that was basically a childhood dream to be a novelist.
Right. Well, and I mean, I guess that's the reason I ask. I mean, again, being around politics all these years, I think it's easy to become a little jaded, but it's nice. And one of the reasons I love doing this because I think it's still fabulous to be around people who are creatives and who enjoy the creativity um, aside from maybe how the business treats the creative in this world, which is never good. Creatives have their 1% too, right? If you're in that stratosphere, there's probably nothing better. But for everyone else who's trying to shuffle along and just pay the bills and everything, I know it can be a little challenging. But it's still being a creative is fun, and it's a fun thing to do, I think. So I enjoy being around creative people because there's a lot of energy there. So I'm not going to poo-poo winning an Emmy. I think that's really fabulous stuff. I have only one other question, and I always do a closing question that I hope is fun. I mean for it to be fun. And what I do is I'm going to give you three names, three people, and I'm going to ask you to pick the one that, presuming I had the magical power to put you together with any one of these three people to have a drink, dinner, whatever it is, who would you choose and why? And the options I'm going to give you are J. Paul Getty, who needs no introduction, Frances Betancourt Myers, who I believe is still the richest woman in the world, and Elliot Spitzer, who might also need no introduction.
I think I did an episode of Law and Order loosely based on the Elliot Spitzer saga.
I think I saw that one. I saw it.
What was that club called? The house of the bordello had a.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I don't remember. I covered that a little bit too because I covered state capitals for LexisNexis, so I remember that too when it happened. What a downfall! I mean,
yeah, there's been a lot of downfalls in the last few years, as you may have.
Yeah.
You may have known. I knew one guy personally got Me Too'd out of a big job, but he did some really stupid stuff. I think I'd go with Spitzer because I think he's seen the high and the low, and there's a greater variety of interesting things to talk about. Whereas these rich people are so kind of insulated, so isolated, that I think it'd be less interesting. I'll take Spitzer. I'll love a drink with Elliot Spitzer and maybe, I don't know, meet some of his friends just in a casual manner.
He would be fascinating. So, I covered I have state houses and governor's offices for a long time for LexisNexis. So I traveled around a lot, and I never met Elliot Spitzer. Met Cuomo and Hochul and a few other folks, and I'm not with them anymore. But I always regret it. I wish I'd had a chance because he just seems so intense, right? It would have been an interesting.
Yeah, I think he would be. Yeah, which Cuomo did you meet? The older or the younger or both?
Andrew. Yeah, not Mario.
I hear he's not the nicest human being in the world, but
no. My interaction was really fleeting, wasn't a thing. But I've known people who work for him, and they don't have much positive stuff.
I know he was sort of a. Yeah. Anyway, well,
not uncommon. I will tell you, not uncommon. There's an old saw that says half of getting a job like that is wanting it, and a lot of times the wanting it comes from a place that's really ego driven. And I've met some really, really good folks in this business, and some others who may put on a good facade, but behind the scenes, boy, there's a couple of them are pretty well known now that I could tell you, but I won't. Same thing. I will not draw names.
When I was a very young journalist, I interviewed Jimmy Carter when he was running for president, and he spent half the interview telling me the virtues of peanut oil for frying food in, why it was better than other kinds of oil. It was our interview. So the peanut oil on one side of the pan, the flavors won't translate. Peanut oil keeps the flavors discreet in the pan. I went,
well,
this man should be president.
If the election hadn't worked out, he still needed to sell product, man.
That was
yeah.
This
was fabulous. That was my final question. I'm going to I'm going to let you off the hook now, but I wanted to say thank you again very much. Again, I'm going to hold the book up again for anyone who hasn't seen it, hopefully out of the glare. Wealth Management, Edward Zuckerman. This really is a great book. I read a ton of stuff, as you might imagine. This is different from most thrillers that you're going to read, in a very good way. It is a hoot from the moment you pick it up to the moment you put it down. I really cannot recommend it high enough. Ed, I really appreciate you being here to talk about it and about your career. It's a lot of fun for me. I hope for you as well.
Oh, it was great. It was great. Thank you very much, and I'm glad you liked the book. And yeah, what else is there to say?
Yep, there you go. All right. Well, the one thing I will say, the same thing I say to everybody here every week, again, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Help other people find the show. Give me a good rating. That really helps other people find the show. And, it makes me happy. So if you care about one of those, that'd be great. I don't care whatever reason, just hit subscribe. That'd be fabulous. Also, tune in next time. I'll be bringing you more great writers from across the literary spectrum. As you may know, we've had songwriters and playwrights, as well as novelists, of course, some nonfiction folks. We've even had some White House correspondents, etc. So, you never know what you might get on the open mic. But I do know this: tomorrow is not promised to any of us. So please, whatever you do, make today count. This has been Rich Eisen, and this has been the Open Mic.